Our next talk is Game Demands, Are They What They Seem? By Ben Jones.
Thank you.
Okay, so this talk is based on Dale Reed's PhD, and Dale's PhD was, so Dale 3 years ago at the start of our project was tasked with go out and understand the game. Go out and tell us more about the game than tell us something about the game that we don't know. So going back to the talk that we started with, we had a lot of discussions around which of these playing pathways are the most hard, which are the best for the developing player, which were the most challenging. And we genuinely sat there and we thought we knew, but we had no objective data to know or make decisions. So Dale unfortunately can't be with us today because he's gone away to collect some more GPS data. So I'm going to present his work on looking at the demands of rugby union, academy rugby union players, looking at mainly focus on does training prepare players for the demands of a match, and then looking at the peak demands, and then actually is everything what it seems in terms of the rugby union as a game at this youth level. So just to start probably at the end, but to provide some context, and again it's based on some of Paddy's work. If we understand the demands of a match, the way that we then look at it is, or the way that we then work back is, okay, well, does training prepare players for a match? And I suppose that these two ways of looking at that. The first simplistic way or logical way of doing that is saying, does training prepare players for the hardest parts of a match, or does it look like a match? But then the caveat to that is, if training should look like a match, then just play loads of matches. So we've got to be cautious of that. Now, Paddy's work, he GPS'd a large group of players during a week, and then looked at a game at the end of the week. And from the training within the week, he looked at the peak demands of that. So, for example, if you train Tuesday, Thursday, play Saturday, and you do a hard contact session on the Tuesday and a high running session on the Thursday, in Paddy's work he didn't average them, he just took the peak demands of each of these to look at, well, actually during that week they have been exposed to either the collision or the running demands. So we then compared that to look at how they differed between players in an academy and those players in a school environment. So when you look at the sub-elite cohort, which are our school players, we split them by forwards and back, and anything that's below this line here, so the units is a standardised effect size, so anything below this line shows that training was harder than a match. Anything above the line shows that the match was higher than training. So if we look at the red dots as our backs and the yellow dots as our forwards, we can see from duration, distance, relative distance, and other units of measurement from our microtechnology unit, that actually typically for forwards, training was harder than a match for them. For our backs, match was harder than training. These are our school cohort. When we looked at that within our academy cohort, you can see that the training appears more representative to a match because it's closer to zero. So if those dots are on zero, training and match are the same in terms of exposures. So straight away that led us to question, okay, well, it doesn't appear that the players are being exposed to the same demands as what's in a match. We're not sure whether that's right or wrong yet. But actually that again leads into we need to understand these match demands more to understand what training should or shouldn't look like. So Dale's done a number of studies and it's ranged from various population groups. So this is looking at representative players. So this is players that were part of the county team. And the first thing that Dale did, we were interested in looking at under 16s, under 18s and under 20s. What does the game look like? So the unit of measurement that I'll focus on today is relative distance. So the average distance covered per time. Obviously given the duration of the game is longer for under 20s than it is under 16s. So when we look at forwards versus back, the two positional groups that we assume we know a lot around, if we start with under 20s, okay, backs had a higher running demand than forwards, which is logical. Under 18s, there was a likely difference. Under 16s, an unclear difference. So in terms of what that game looks like, positionally, the between position differences differ by age group. So actually, those under 16 players, they weren't that different between forwards and backs. where actually we all assume, based on our reference point of being the international senior game, that surely the backs do loads more running than the forwards. That's what everyone does. Now, contextually, and we haven't done this, examples may be around skill level. If the ball gets dropped, the backs get to let the ball less, they have to do less work, etc. So we need to understand some of these contextual issues as well. But then we were then interested in, okay, if that's within the level, what about by age group? What about when players progress? And again, unlike other sports, you can see here for this group here, the backs, the relative distance decreased. So as players got older, they did less running. So actually, the game at the younger age may not be what we think it is at the older age. Now, the logical thing that you could add in there is that players do more contact and do more collision. The other thing is that running demands in a game aren't always a good thing. If you watch someone who's technically very good and positionally very good, they can do less running than do more running than someone who's positionally very good. So more doesn't mean better. But actually, it's probably not the logic that we thought we'd see, as in, as players progress through age groups, the game gets harder. We're not sure, it gets different. When we look at then the forwards, we could see between the under-16s and under-18s, they were similar, and between under-18s and 20, there was a very likely decrease in the amount of running that players did within the game, as this metres per minute. So, is all as it seems? I'm not sure. And then, Dale did another study where he looked at that within the school and the university programme. And you can see here that between under-16s and under-18s, for forwards, the running demands decreased as well. So university players typically will do less running in a match than school players. But with the backs, that actually increased. So again, we've got to probably understand, and this is all early work, we've got to understand why, we've got the what now, why that happened, and is that a problem, or do we need to intervene or make some changes? And then the next question that we had was, going back to Paddy's early work, is that actually players are playing in concurrent pathways and they're playing in different levels, and we've got to make a decision at some point which they do and don't play for. So we then looked at the players who played in the academy versus those that played in the school programme. So you can see here for total distance and player load, which is our proxy measure of collision because it's from an accelerometer, you can see that the academy was almost certainly or almost likely, they covered more distance in the academy than they did in the school. So physically, you could say that the academy games are tougher running demand than the school game. So again, looking at with the match exposure that players are exposed to, is that appropriate for the long-term development of a potential international player versus a player that's playing because they like rugby? When we look at then the collisions, we can see the actual accelerometer between the academy and the school. We didn't really see anything there, but that may be just in our method of trying to quantify collision, because rugby union is not just a running sport, as we all know. So this is an example of, this is probably a great example of the working fast and the working slow, because the early stuff that I just presented then was almost the working fast. Let's create some what's really quickly to feed back to the coaches. But what Dale then did, he took 2 seasons worth of data, he hated doing it, and he cut the GPS file whistle to whistle. So the GPS file was cut based on ball out of play, based on attacking, and based on defending. So you got 2 seasons worth of data, about 3 months of kind of coding. Again, this is a slow question because you're not going to get the answers back quick. But this was to further our understanding. And the logic behind this was, if everything's based on averages and based on, total distance, averages, etc., what we're doing, I'm not sure we weren't sure that's what rugby union is. Because if you look at this as a GPS velocity trace, and you drew a line of the average, that probably misses everything that's important, which is probably here. So we need to then almost look at a different way of reporting and analysing the data that we've got, as opposed to on average this player did this, because when you're averaging peak demands and low demands, you get something that's moderate that maybe doesn't tell you what we need to know. So the first observation from the academy data that Dale coded was that ball in play time was about 27 minutes. So about 37% of the time the ball was in play. So again, as a coach, we can then use that as preparing our players, not for 75 minutes of match play, but actually for this 27 minutes of activity. We also then looked at the mean cycle. So the cycle was when the ball was in play before it went out of play. And you can see that obviously attacking and defending, the mean cycle, this was about 26 seconds for both. So the mean cycle before the ball went out of play was about 26 seconds. And the maximum cycle for both attacking and defending was 96 seconds for attack and 113 seconds for defending. So now we can start understanding a little bit more complex stuff around the game. So then the questions led then to, okay, well, we know we have these two positional groups. How do they differ between each other when we look at it in this way? And when we looked at attack, so again using relative distance as our variable, when we looked at attack, you can see the variability in the data. So there's very little difference between forwards and backs. Now remember as well that backs do more running than forwards. We know that, we knew that. So when we looked at it in attack, there wasn't any difference. Okay, well maybe the backs do more running in defence. No, the forwards actually did more running in defence than the backs. So where did the backs do the running? The backs did their running when the ball was out, the extra metres when the ball was out of play. Repositioning. So actually in terms of our preparation of the game and our preparation of players, we need to understand which parts of the activity profiles we're including and whether they're important. Because if we're including low intensity repositioning as opposed to high intensity key decision making, key periods of the game, we're probably losing actually the important context of the game. So that's where we kind of went to with that. It took me longer to find that video than it did to do the presentation. So we then did. Kind of based on this, we were then interested in, okay, well, if we know the attack versus the defence and the ball out of play, what is actually the peak demands of the game? Because the peak demands of the game could be a transition from attack to defence or defence to attack. So we may actually miss that with what we did before. So what we did with this study, in collaboration with the Catapult and England Rugby, we GPS'd a large number of academy under-18s game. And then we looked at the peak demands. So when we look at the peak 3-minute demands of the game, that's kind of based on the GPS file, that's 0 to 3, and the coding window will shuffle along at 10th of a second. So we're definitely going to pick the peak demands. And we can see there that when we look at the peak demands for overall for 3 minutes for the forwards and the backs, that the backs actually do have greater running demands in these peak demands for 3 minutes. We also can then start providing some target reference data. So if you've got a 3-minute drill and you want to replicate the hardest part of that game, we know what that looks like. The players need to cover on average about 360 metres, a max of about 530 metres. So we can now start preparing players for the peak demands as opposed to the average demands, which include a lot of standing, a lot of ball out of play, etc. And we saw that from that 27 minutes of ball in play time. So how can we do that? So this is again based on some of Dan's work. I think the way that we do that and the way that we then start profiling data and using data is then appreciate our skills in terms of our ability to expose players to different stimuluses. So again, if you look at the 0 there, the 0 would indicate that the two training modalities were the same. So conditioning versus small-sided games, conditioning versus skills, conditioning versus speed, small-sided game versus skills, small-sided games versus speed, skills versus speed. So for conditioning and small-sided games, we can typically see that the external load exposures are similar because they're close to that line. So if we're, as coaches are, short of time, what should we be prioritising? Well, if small-sided games do the same thing as conditioning and they have a ball in the hand, it's probably more beneficial. But then if we compare speed exposure to skills, you can see that they're massively different in terms of their physical exposure. So we can do the skill to improve the technical tactical, but we still need that speed stimulus to expose athletes to that high speed running. So we're at the stage now within our journey of Dale's working to almost come up with a drill where people can use for different times in terms of replicating these peak demands, but also not just the peak demands for the progression, the next level, which should also help people in practice. And then finally, to finish off, again back to some of Paddy's work, the external load isn't everything because of the complexity of the game. So if you look here, so what Paddy did here is he took the same group of players who sat in a school game and an academy game and compared their external load and their responses. So if we compare when the players played either the sub-elite match or the elite match, there was very little difference in relative distance and also relative player load. They were similar. Where the differences were in these responses to it. So despite the differences not being, the external load not being similar, the RPE was greater in the academy game as opposed to the school game. The fatigue responses were greater in the academy than the school, as was the upper body soreness and the well-being. So it goes back to about Sean's about making sure that we're looking at more than one thing, because the external load is one thing, but it's not everything. We need to understand the response to that external load. So in summary, we need to probably look at modifying training to prepare players for position-specific demands and progressions. The average running demands may not reflect the true demands, and we need to start now looking at the peak demands. Training modalities can be used to develop specific skills and qualities. And players also need to be prepared for the running and the contact part independently within rugby union. So we need to look at the preparation of the contact element as well for progression. Thank you.